Mother? Daniel! What the hell is going on? The words burst out of me before I could even think. My voice cracked, trembling with disbelief and rage. My heart slammed against my ribs as I stood frozen at the doorway, my brain struggling to make sense of the sight before me. There they were, Daniel, my Daniel, half naked, his shirt crumpled on the floor, his lips pressed against hers. My mother. "Get out!" I growled, my voice low and dangerous, though it was barely above a whisper. "Both of you, get out!" They turned to me, their faces pale as ghosts, but neither of them moved. My mother's expression flickered with something I couldn't place. Fear? Guilt? Shame? No, it wasn't shame. It was annoyance, as if I was the one intruding. Daniel, on the other hand, just stared at me with wide, panicked eyes, stammering something incomprehensible. "Get out!" I screamed this time, my voice echoing off the walls. My hands trembled at my sides, clenched into fists so tight that my nails dug into my palms. They scrambled. Daniel grabbed his shirt and stumbled past me, muttering pathetic apologies that only made me angrier. My mother followed, her gaze locked on the floor as if the carpet had suddenly become the most interesting thing in the world. I didn't care. I didn't want to hear their excuses. When the door slammed shut behind them, the silence felt deafening. My knees buckled, and I sank to the floor, staring at the empty space where they had stood moments ago. My chest heaved as I gasped for air, tears burning my eyes. How? How could they? The memories came flooding back, mocking me. Daniel's late-night work meetings. My mother's sudden interest in helping him plan the wedding, always volunteering to check in on him when I was busy. I had thought it was sweet, her way of welcoming him into the family. How blind could I have been? I reached for my phone with shaking hands, desperate for answers, but unsure where to start. My fingers hovered over the screen before I opened Daniel's messages. Part of me didn't want to look. Part of me knew what I'd find. And there it was. A string of texts between them. Flirty, suggestive, explicit. The timestamp stretched back months. While I was choosing flower arrangements and cake flavors, they were sneaking around behind my back. A cold, hollow ache spread through my chest as I read the words I could never unsee. I can't stop thinking about last night. I'll make up an excuse to see you again tomorrow. I love you. The last text made me drop the phone as though it had burned me. Love? He loved her? My mother? I felt like I was drowning. My vision blurred with tears, and I pressed my palms against my face, trying to steady my breathing. It didn't work. My entire world was crumbling, and I had no idea how to stop it. This wasn't just betrayal. This was humiliation. This was theft. They had stolen my trust, my future, my sense of stability, and they had done it so carelessly, so brazenly, right under my nose. My phone buzzed, and for a moment I thought it might be Daniel. Or worse, her. Instead, it was my best friend, Sophie. "Everything okay? You left the rehearsal dinner early." The words stared back at me, and for a moment I debated how to respond. Should I tell her? Should I tell anyone? The answer came as a fresh wave of rage surged through me. Yes. I would tell Sophie. I would tell everyone. They didn't deserve my silence. They didn't deserve my protection. I wiped my tears, my hands trembling, but my resolve hardening. This was far from over. They thought they could do this to me and walk away? No. Not without consequences. Not without me fighting back. I still remember the first time I saw Daniel. It was one of those days that felt like it had no purpose, just another gray Tuesday in a string of ordinary weeks. I was at the coffee shop downtown, hiding behind my laptop and pretending to work when he walked in. He was tall, with messy dark hair that looked like he'd just rolled out of bed, but somehow made it work. His eyes were this shade of hazel that seemed to catch the light differently every time he turned his head. I didn't notice him at first, but he noticed me. "Excuse me," he had said, his voice warm but hesitant. "Is this seat taken?" I glanced up, distracted, ready to give him a polite smile and a dismissive no. But when I met his gaze, I froze. There was something about him, an ease, a quiet confidence that wasn't intimidating but intriguing. Before I could overthink it, I gestured to the chair across from me. "Go ahead," I mumbled, suddenly hyper-aware of my slightly messy hair and the coffee stain on my sleeve. He sat down, pulled out a book, something by Murakami I remember, and we didn't talk after that. Not for a while. But every so often, I'd catch him glancing at me, and eventually, I couldn't help but ask, "Good book?" It was such a simple question, but the way his face lit up, you'd think I'd just solved the mysteries of the universe. That was how it started. Our beginning. Daniel had this way of making the ordinary feel extraordinary. After that first meeting, we ran into each other again, at the same coffee shop, almost like it was fate. The second time, he didn't ask if the seat was taken. He just sat down and smiled, as if we were already old friends. We talked for hours that day, about books, movies, places we wanted to travel. I don't even remember how many coffees I drank, but I remember walking home with this strange, fluttery feeling in my chest. One date turned into another, and soon he became the center of my world. He was attentive in a way I hadn't experienced before. He'd surprise me with little notes tucked into my bag, saying things like, "You've got this," on the mornings of big meetings, or "Can't wait to see you tonight," after we'd planned a dinner date. He noticed everything, my favorite flowers, peonies, how I always added too much cream to my coffee, the way I hummed when I was nervous. He said it was those little things that made him fall in love with me, and I believed him. The proposal. By the time we'd been together for 3 years, I thought I knew everything about him. He'd met my family, charmed them with his quick wit and easy smile. My mother, in particular, adored him. "He's a keeper," she'd said more than once, and I'd always nodded, beaming. When he proposed, it was everything I had ever dreamed of. It was a chilly evening in late November, and he insisted we go to our favorite park for a walk. I remember teasing him about it. "It's freezing, Daniel. Can't we just stay in and watch a movie?" But he was persistent, wrapping me in an oversized scarf and grabbing my gloves before practically dragging me out the door. The park was nearly empty, the trees stripped bare of their leaves. There was something quiet and magical about the way the city lights reflected off the frost-covered ground. He led me to the little bridge where we'd had our first kiss, and before I could say anything, he stopped walking. "Daniel, what's—" But then he was kneeling, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. My breath caught. "I've been thinking about this moment for months," he began, his voice steady but his hands trembling slightly. "You are everything to me, my best friend, my partner, my safe place. I don't know what I did to deserve you, but I promise to spend the rest of my life proving I'm worthy of you. Will you marry me?" Tears spilled down my cheeks before I could even get the words out. "Yes," I whispered, then louder, "Yes, of course." He slipped the ring onto my finger, a delicate band with a small diamond that sparkled in the faint light, and pulled me into his arms. For a moment, it felt like time had stopped. The world faded, and it was just us, two people madly in love, standing on that bridge and making promises we both believed we'd keep. The dream. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of planning and excitement. We picked out venues, tasted cakes, and debated color schemes. Every step of the way, Daniel was by my side, holding my hand, making me laugh when I got stressed. "This wedding isn't just about one day," he told me once, kissing my forehead. "It's about us, about forever." I'd never been happier. I truly thought I'd found my forever. But looking back now, I wonder, how much of it was real? Was it all a lie, or just a moment in time that slipped away before either of us noticed? What haunts me most is how perfect it all seemed. How easy it was to believe in him, to trust him with my heart. I gave him everything, my love, my loyalty, my future. And for what? For nothing but betrayal. It started as a flicker, a tiny whisper in the back of my mind that I tried to ignore. At first, it seemed harmless. Just a trick of the imagination, paranoia born from the stress of planning a wedding. I told myself I was overthinking, that I was letting small things snowball into something they weren't. But the feeling wouldn't go away. It was little things at first. Daniel and my mom always seemed closer than I expected. Not in a way that screamed inappropriate, but just enough to make me pause. When they talked, It felt like I was on the outside looking in, as if there was a language between them I didn't quite understand. Inside jokes I hadn't heard before. A level of ease that felt out of place. The first time I noticed it, we were having dinner at my mom's house. She had invited us over to discuss wedding plans, and everything seemed normal, until it didn't. "I'm thinking roses for the centerpieces," I said, holding up a photo from a magazine. Daniel replied, his focus shifting to my mom, who was setting down a tray of drinks. "What do you think, Laura?" Laura. Not your mom. Not Mrs. Whitaker. Just Laura. She smiled, that warm, practiced smile she always used. "Roses are nice, but they're a little predictable, don't you think? You could do something more unique. Maybe orchids?" "Orchids," Daniel echoed, nodding thoughtfully. "Yeah, I like that idea." I stared at them, caught off guard by how naturally they seemed to agree. I waited for Daniel to look at me, to ask for my opinion, but he didn't. It felt like I had been erased from the conversation entirely. Later that night, I brought it up. "Do you think you're maybe a little too comfortable with my mom?" Daniel frowned, pulling me into his arms as we lay in bed. "What are you talking about? She's your mom. I'm just trying to get along with her." "I know," I said hesitantly, "but sometimes it feels like you two are—" "Hey," he interrupted, pressing a kiss to my forehead. "You're overthinking this. I love you, okay? That's all that matters." His words soothed me at the time, but the unease lingered. The second incident. It wasn't long after that when something else happened. I came home earlier than expected one afternoon, exhausted from a chaotic day at work, and found them in the kitchen. Daniel was leaning against the counter, laughing at something my mom had said. She was standing too close, her hand brushing his arm as she spoke. The sight stopped me in my tracks. "What's so funny?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light. They both turned to me, startled. My mom recovered first, smiling in that effortless way of hers. "Oh, nothing. Daniel was just telling me about your last date night. That story about the waiter spilling wine everywhere? Hilarious." I didn't remember telling her that story. "Right," I said slowly, my eyes narrowing as I looked at Daniel. He avoided my gaze, suddenly very interested in the mug of coffee in his hands. It was a small moment, insignificant on its own, but it gnawed at me. Why was he telling her stories about us? And why did it feel like there was something unspoken between them, just beneath the surface? The late-night call. The turning point came one evening when Daniel's phone buzzed on the nightstand. He was in the shower, and I wouldn't have looked at it if the name flashing on the screen hadn't caught my eye. Mom. It wasn't unusual for her to call me, but Daniel? That was different. Curiosity got the better of me. I stared at the phone, my heart racing, debating whether to answer it. Before I could make a decision, the call ended, leaving me with a sick feeling in the pit of my stomach. When Daniel came out of the bathroom, I asked him about it. "Why was my mom calling you?" He froze for a fraction of a second, just long enough for me to notice. Then he shrugged, running a towel through his hair. "She wanted to ask about the caterer. I told her to call you, but she said you were busy." It was a perfectly reasonable explanation, but the way he avoided my eyes set off alarm bells in my head. Doubt and denial. Over the next few weeks, I started paying closer attention, searching for clues I didn't want to find. I noticed how my mom always seemed to linger when Daniel was around, her laughter just a little too loud at his jokes. I noticed how Daniel's demeanor shifted when she entered the room, how he seemed more animated, more attentive. But every time I tried to confront my suspicions, I second-guessed myself. Was I being paranoid? Was the stress of wedding planning making me see problems that weren't there? One night, I confided in Sophie. "Do you think it's weird?" I asked, twisting the engagement ring on my finger. "How close they've gotten." Sophie hesitated, biting her lip. "I mean, maybe a little. But it's not like anything's happening, right?" "No, of course not," I said quickly, though even as the words left my mouth, I didn't believe them. I wanted to trust them. I wanted to believe that the man I loved and the woman who raised me would never betray me. But the nagging feeling in my gut told me otherwise. I started avoiding situations where the three of us would be together. I told myself it was for my own peace of mind, but deep down, I knew the truth. I was scared of what I might see, scared of what I might find. I didn't know it then, but the first cracks in my perfect life had already begun to form, and soon, everything would come crashing down. I sat on the floor of Sophie's apartment, my head in my hands, as the weight of everything crashed down on me again. My chest felt tight, my breaths shallow, as though my body was physically rejecting what my mind had finally accepted. "I still can't believe it," I whispered, my voice hoarse from crying. "I walked in on them, Sophie. Them, my mom, Daniel. How does that even happen?" Sophie knelt beside me, her arms wrapping tightly around my shoulders. "You don't have to explain anything, okay? They're disgusting. Both of them. You did nothing wrong." Her words were meant to soothe, but they couldn't touch the storm of emotions tearing me apart inside. Anger, humiliation, heartbreak, it all swirled together until I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. "I should have seen it," I murmured, more to myself than to her. "All the signs were there. I didn't want to believe it." "And why would you?" Sophie said fiercely. "You trusted them. That's not a flaw, it's a strength. They're the ones who betrayed you, not the other way around." I nodded weakly, but the knot in my stomach remained. Trust. What a cruel joke. "Listen," Sophie said, pulling back to look me in the eye. "You don't owe them anything. Not your silence, not your forgiveness, nothing. And you sure as hell don't owe Daniel a wedding." The word hit me like a slap. The wedding. I had spent months pouring my heart into planning it, dreaming of the moment I'd walk down the aisle and see Daniel waiting for me at the end. The thought of it now made me want to scream. "I need to cancel it," I said suddenly, my voice shaking. Sophie's face softened, and she squeezed my hand. "We'll do it together." The cancellation. That night, Sophie and I sat at her kitchen table, each armed with our phones and laptops. My hands trembled as I typed out the message, my stomach churning with dread. "Dear friends and family, due to unforeseen circumstances, the wedding has been canceled. Thank you for your understanding during this difficult time. It was short, cold, and to the point, exactly what I needed it to be." "You sure you want to send it?" Sophie asked, her thumb hovering over the screen of her own phone, ready to forward the message to her contacts. I took a deep breath, then nodded. "Do it." And just like that, it was done. The wedding was officially over, and with it, the future I thought I'd been building with Daniel. I expected to feel relief, but all I felt was emptiness. Picking up the pieces. In the days that followed, Sophie became my lifeline. She refused to let me wallow in my misery, dragging me out of the apartment whenever she noticed the sadness creeping back in. "You need fresh air," she'd insist, pulling me toward the door despite my protests. "You're not going to feel better if you keep hiding away." One afternoon, she convinced me to take a walk in the park, the same park where Daniel had proposed. The memory hit me like a punch to the gut as soon as we arrived, but Sophie was there, her presence steady and grounding. "I thought this place might be hard for you," she admitted, slipping her arm through mine. "But I didn't want you to avoid it forever. You deserve to take it back, you know? Make it yours again." Her words surprised me. I hadn't thought about it that way. Maybe she was right. Maybe I needed to reclaim the parts of my life that Daniel had tainted. We walked in silence for a while, the crisp air biting at our cheeks. I felt lighter than I had in days, though the ache in my chest remained. "Hey," Sophie said suddenly, her tone brightening. "There's someone I want you to meet." I turned to her, confused. "What? Who?" She grinned mischievously. "My brother." Before I could protest, a tall figure approached us from the other end of the path. He was older than Sophie, with the same piercing blue eyes, but a more rugged, mature presence. His dark hair was slightly tousled, and his smile was warm and inviting. "This is Mark," Sophie said, gesturing between us. "Mark, this is my best friend, the one I'm always talking about." Mark held out his hand, his gaze meeting mine. "It's nice to finally meet you. Sophie's told me a lot about you." I shook his hand, feeling a strange sense of calm wash over me. "Good things, I hope." He chuckled, the sound deep and reassuring. Only good things. A new connection. We spent the afternoon walking together, the three of us falling into an easy rhythm. Mark was kind and attentive, always making sure to include me in the conversation without being overbearing. When Sophie stepped away to take a phone call, leaving us alone, I felt a flicker of nervousness, unsure of what to say. But Mark didn't seem to mind the silence. "Rough week, huh?" he said gently, his tone free of judgment. I nodded, looking down at the path beneath my feet. "You could say that." He didn't press me for details, and for that, I was grateful. Instead, he changed the subject, asking about my favorite books, movies, and the places I'd always wanted to travel. For the first time in what felt like forever, I laughed. By the time Sophie returned, I felt lighter somehow, as if a small piece of the weight I'd been carrying had lifted. That night, as I lay in bed replaying the day in my mind, I realized something. The world hadn't ended, even though it had felt like it would. There was still life beyond the pain, still moments of connection and laughter waiting to be found. And maybe, just maybe, Mark was the beginning of something new. Spending time with Sophie and Mark had become a strange sort of comfort. The three of us would go on long walks, laughing and chatting about anything that came to mind. At first, I thought Sophie was just trying to keep me distracted, to help me forget the chaos Daniel and my mother had unleashed on my life. But as the days turned into weeks, I started to look forward to those outings. Mark had a way of making things feel easy. He didn't pry into my feelings or push me to open up, but he listened whenever I wanted to talk. His presence was calm and steady, like an anchor in the storm that was my life. Sophie, of course, was always there, teasing him about his stories or nudging me with a knowing grin when I laughed at his jokes a little too hard. We spent hours wandering through parks, grabbing coffee from little stands, or sitting on benches while Sophie told embarrassing stories about her and Mark's childhood. I learned so much about him during those walks, that he had a dry sense of humor that snuck up on you, that he loved hiking and photography, and that he had a protective streak a mile wide. At first, I thought the connection I felt with him was just because he was kind, that it was just relief to be treated with respect after everything I'd been through. But it started to feel like more, and that scared me. One evening, after another walk that ended with us watching the sunset by the river, I received a message that caught me completely off guard. It was from Mark. "Hey, I was wondering if you'd like to grab dinner with me tomorrow. Just us. I know Sophie usually drags us out together, but I thought it might be nice to talk without her interrupting every 5 minutes." I stared at the screen, my heart skipping a beat. It wasn't what I expected, but I couldn't deny the warmth it brought. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before I typed back, "I'd like that." His reply came almost immediately. "Great, I'll pick you up at 7. The next evening, Mark arrived right on time. He greeted me with a smile that was both confident and kind, and for a moment, I forgot about everything that had happened with Daniel. He looked different than usual, more polished, his dark button-up shirt emphasizing the blue in his eyes. When he told me I looked beautiful, I felt a warmth rise to my cheeks that I hadn't felt in a long time. The restaurant he chose was cozy and unpretentious, the kind of place where you could sit for hours without feeling rushed. Over dinner, we talked about everything, his favorite hiking spots, my childhood dreams, and even some of the more ridiculous moments from Sophie's teenage years, which he recounted with a playful grin. I found myself laughing more than I had in weeks. After dinner, we decided to take a walk along the riverfront. The city lights reflected on the water, and the quiet hum of the evening felt like a balm to my frayed nerves. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt normal. Mark was easy to talk to, and the conversation flowed naturally, filled with gentle teasing and moments of shared silence that felt comfortable instead of awkward. We were nearing the end of our walk when a voice stopped me in my tracks. "Well, isn't this cozy?" I froze, my heart dropping into my stomach. Daniel. He was standing a few feet away, his hands shoved into his pockets, his expression twisted into a sneer. My entire body tensed as memories of that awful day came flooding back. "What do you want, Daniel?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "I want to talk," he said, stepping closer. "You can't just cut me out like this. We were supposed to get married, remember?" Mark stepped in front of me, his stance calm but protective. "She doesn't owe you a conversation," he said firmly. "You need to leave." Daniel scoffed, his eyes narrowing. "Who the hell are you? Her new boyfriend? Didn't take you long, huh?" I flinched at his words, but Mark didn't react. Instead, he kept his gaze steady, his voice calm but unyielding. "I'm someone who respects her boundaries," he said. "Now, walk away before you embarrass yourself any further." Daniel's face twisted with anger, and for a moment I thought he might lash out. But then he glanced at me, his expression flickering with something that almost looked like regret. "This isn't over," he muttered, before turning and disappearing into the night. I let out a shaky breath, my hands trembling as I tried to process what had just happened. Mark turned to me, his expression softening. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. I nodded, though the adrenaline still pulsed through me. "I think so. Thank you for stepping in like that." "You don't have to thank me," he said, his voice steady. "No one has the right to treat you that way." His words were simple, but they meant more than I could express. For the first time in weeks, I felt safe. When Mark walked me to my door later, I hesitated, unsure of what to say. The evening had been wonderful despite Daniel's interruption, and I didn't want it to end on a sour note. "Thank you," I said finally, my voice soft, "for everything." He smiled, his gaze holding mine for a moment longer than usual. "Anytime. You deserve to be treated with respect. Don't forget that." As I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, I realized something. The scars Daniel had left wouldn't heal overnight, but maybe, just maybe, I didn't have to face them alone. Mark wasn't just a distraction or a kind gesture from Sophie. He was becoming something more. And for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to embrace whatever came next. The apartment was quiet, save for the occasional hum of passing cars outside. I sat curled up on the couch, a blanket wrapped around me, staring at the untouched cup of tea on the table. My mind was anything but calm, spiraling through memories and doubts that refused to let me go. I thought about Daniel. Not just the betrayal, though that memory burned like an open wound, but the moments before it all fell apart. The times when he made me laugh, the way he'd brush my hair behind my ear and tell me he couldn't wait to spend his life with me. It felt so genuine then, so real. I had believed him with all my heart. That was the part that hurt the most. Not just what he did, but how deeply I had trusted him. I had given him everything. My love, my vulnerability, my future. And he had thrown it away, not just with someone else, but with my own mother. How could I let that happen? How could I have been so blind? The questions haunted me. I replayed every moment, searching for the cracks I should have noticed, the red flags I should have seen. I told myself that love makes you blind, that it makes you see the best in people even when they don't deserve it. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had failed myself by ignoring my instincts. Now, here I was, standing at another crossroads, and the fear of making the wrong choice was paralyzing. Mark. His name alone stirred something in me, a mix of warmth and unease. He was nothing like Daniel, I knew that much. He was kind, patient, and steady in a way that made me feel safe. But that was what terrified me. Daniel had once made me feel that way too. What if I was wrong again? What if I let myself hope, only to have it ripped away all over again? The thought of trusting someone again felt like stepping into the dark, unsure if the ground would hold beneath me. But then there was another part of me, quieter but insistent, that whispered something else. What if Mark wasn't like Daniel? What if he was exactly who he seemed to be, a good man who genuinely cared about me? What if I was letting my fear of the past ruin my chance at something real? I let out a heavy sigh, leaning back against the couch and closing my eyes. The memories of my walks with Mark surfaced unbidden, the way he listened without judgment, the way he could make me laugh even when I felt like crying, the way he looked at me, like I was more than the sum of my broken pieces. Could I let myself believe in that? The doubts still lingered, but something else was beginning to take root. A small, fragile hope. Maybe I wasn't as broken as I thought. Maybe I was allowed to want more for myself, to believe that I deserved happiness even after everything that had happened. The realization was slow, like a sunrise creeping over the horizon, but once it came, it filled me with a tentative warmth. I wasn't ready to tell Mark how I felt. Not yet. There was still a part of me that needed time to heal, to make peace with the scars Daniel had left behind. But I was ready to take a step forward, to give myself permission to hope again. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of clarity. I didn't know what the future held, but I was willing to find out. Mark was patient, and I knew he wouldn't push me. And maybe, just maybe, he was worth the risk. I stood up, pulling the blanket tighter around me as I walked to the window. The city lights stretched out before me, and for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to imagine a future that wasn't weighed down by the past. It wouldn't be easy, I knew that much. There would still be doubts, still be fears that whispered I was making a mistake. But I wasn't going to let those fears control me anymore. I deserved to be happy, and I was ready to fight for it. Tomorrow, I'd see Mark again. I wouldn't say anything, not yet, but I'd let myself take that first step toward something new, something better. And as I stood there, watching the quiet world outside, I felt the smallest flicker of hope, like a flame that had been smothered for too long, finally finding air again. The tension between Mark and me started over something small, something I didn't even realize was bothering me until it bubbled to the surface. We were sitting at a cafe, one of our usual places, sipping coffee and chatting about nothing in particular. At first, it was easy, comfortable, like always. But then he mentioned Sophie. "She told me you've been keeping busy lately," he said casually, leaning back in his chair. "It's good. I'm glad you're starting to move on." The words hit me in a way I didn't expect. Move on. Like it was that simple. Like everything I had gone through could just be packed away neatly. No mess, no lingering pain. I knew he meant well, but it felt dismissive, even if he didn't intend it to be. I stiffened, setting my cup down a little too hard. "Move on? Is that what you think I'm doing?" Mark's brow furrowed, his expression shifting to concern. "I didn't mean it like that." "Then how did you mean it?" I snapped, my voice sharper than I intended. "Do you think it's that easy to just forget everything that happened? To act like it didn't completely tear me apart?" He sat up straighter, his hands resting on the table as he looked at me carefully. "No, of course not. I know it's not easy. I just meant, you seem like you're finding your way again. That's all." The frustration bubbled up inside me, and before I could stop myself, I was speaking again. "You don't get it, Mark. You don't know what it's like to trust someone with everything, only to have them destroy it. You don't know what it's like to doubt yourself every single day, wondering if you'll ever be enough." The words hung in the air between us, heavy and raw. Mark's expression softened, but I couldn't bring myself to look at him any longer. I grabbed my bag and stood up. "I need some air," I muttered, leaving before he could respond. The walk home was a blur of emotions, anger, sadness, and an ache in my chest that I couldn't shake. I knew I wasn't really mad at Mark. He hadn't done anything wrong. If anything, I was mad at myself for still carrying so much pain, for letting it spill over onto him. The next few days were quiet. Mark didn't text, and I didn't reach out either. I kept replaying the conversation in my head, hating how I had handled it. He had been nothing but kind to me, and I had lashed out because I was scared. When his name finally appeared on my phone screen, my heart skipped a beat. "Hey, can we talk?" I stared at the message for a moment before typing back, "Yes." We met at the park, the same one where we had spent so many afternoons with Sophie. It felt fitting, somehow, to be back here. Mark was already waiting when I arrived, standing near the fountain with his hands in his pockets. "Hey," I said softly as I approached. He turned to me, his expression unreadable. "Hey." We stood there for a moment, the silence stretching between us until I couldn't take it anymore. "Mark, I'm sorry," I blurted out, my voice shaking. "I shouldn't have snapped at you like that. You didn't deserve it." He shook his head. "You don't have to apologize. I get it. I shouldn't have said what I did. I didn't mean to make you feel like your pain wasn't valid." I took a deep breath, my hands trembling at my sides. "It's not just about that. It's everything. I've been so scared, Mark. Scared of letting myself feel anything again. scared of getting hurt. And then you came into my life, and you made me feel things I didn't think I could feel anymore, and that terrifies me." My voice cracked, tears welling in my eyes as I forced myself to keep going. "I don't want to be scared anymore. I don't want to let what happened with Daniel ruin what could be something good. I don't know if I'm ready, but I want to try. With you." Mark stepped closer, his gaze steady as he reached out to take my hand. His touch was warm, grounding, and for the first time in days, I felt a sense of calm. "You don't have to be ready for everything all at once," he said gently. "We can take it slow. I'm not going anywhere, but I need you to know something too." I looked up at him, my heart pounding. "I feel the same way," he said, his voice soft but sure. "I care about you, more than I can put into words, and I'm willing to wait as long as it takes for you to trust me with your heart." The tears spilled over then, but this time they weren't from sadness. They were from relief, from gratitude, from the realization that maybe, just maybe, I didn't have to face everything alone. We stood there for a long time, hand in hand, the world around us fading into the background. As the weeks went on, our relationship began to bloom in ways I hadn't thought possible. Mark was patient and kind, never pushing me further than I was ready to go. We spent more time together, laughing and talking about everything under the sun. With each passing day, I felt myself letting go of the fear that had held me back for so long. When we finally told Sophie, it was less of an announcement and more of a confirmation of what she already knew. "You two think you're subtle," she said with a laugh, "but I've been waiting for this since the first time we went on one of those walks." Her joy for us was genuine, and it made everything feel even more real. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was standing on solid ground. And as I looked at Mark, his hand resting lightly on mine, I knew that whatever the future held, we would face it together. The weeks with Mark felt like a dream. For the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to be happy. Truly, unapologetically happy. Every moment with him felt safe and grounding, and even in the quiet pauses, I felt more at ease than I ever had before. Sophie often teased us when we spent time together, her sly grins and playful remarks about how cute we were now a regular occurrence. But I didn't mind. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to prove anything to anyone. Mark understood me in ways I hadn't thought possible, and Sophie's unwavering support was a constant reminder that I wasn't alone. But no matter how good things felt, there was one part of my life I hadn't dealt with, and no amount of laughter or comfort could keep it buried forever. It started subtly at first, a faint unease that lingered in the back of my mind. Every time my phone buzzed, I felt a jolt of dread, worried it might be her, my mother. I hadn't answered any of her calls or replied to her messages since the day I caught her and Daniel together, but the silence wasn't giving me the closure I thought it would. Late one night, as I lay in bed with Mark beside me, I found myself staring at my phone, scrolling through the unread messages from her. "I'm so sorry. Please call me. I miss you. Can we talk? You don't have to forgive me, but I need to explain." Each one felt like a stab to the heart. Mark stirred beside me, his arm draping over my waist as he propped himself up on one elbow. "Hey," he said softly. "What's on your mind?" I hesitated, unsure of how to put my feelings into words. "It's my mom," I finally admitted. He didn't say anything, just waited patiently for me to continue. "I thought ignoring her would make it easier," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "But it hasn't. Every time she tries to reach out, it just brings everything back. The betrayal, the lies, all of it. I don't know what to do." Mark reached for my hand, his thumb brushing gently over my knuckles. "You don't have to figure it all out right now," he said. "But maybe it's time to make a decision, for yourself. Whatever you choose, I'll be here. You're not alone in this." His words stayed with me long after he drifted back to sleep. I knew he was right. Ignoring my mother hadn't made the pain go away. It had only let it fester, unresolved and raw. If I wanted to move forward, I needed to face this, no matter how much it hurt. The next day, I called Sophie. "I need to talk to her," I said, as soon as she answered. There was a pause on the other end of the line before Sophie responded. "Are you sure?" "No," I admitted, "but I think it's the only way I can let this go. I need to tell her how I feel, to make it clear that I can't have her in my life anymore. Not after what she did." Sophie's voice softened. "If that's what you need to do, I'm with you. Always." With their support, I finally worked up the courage to make the call. My hands trembled as I dialed her number, the phone feeling heavier than it should. She picked up after the first ring. "Hello?" Her voice was tentative, almost hopeful. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "It's me," I said. "I think we need to talk." The conversation that followed was one of the hardest I'd ever had. My mother apologized over and over, her voice thick with tears, but her words did little to ease the ache in my chest. "I know I can't undo what I've done," she said, her voice breaking. "But I love you, and I can't stand the thought of losing you." I swallowed hard, the lump in my throat threatening to choke me. "You already lost me," I said quietly. "The moment you betrayed me like that, you destroyed everything between us. I can't forgive you, Mom. Not now. Maybe not ever." Her sobs on the other end of the line were almost too much to bear, but I pressed on. "I need to move on with my life," I said, my voice firm despite the tears streaming down my face. "And I can't do that if you're still a part of it. This is goodbye." Before she could respond, I ended the call. The silence that followed was deafening, but for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. That evening, as I sat on the couch with Mark and Sophie, I told them everything. "I think it was the right thing to do," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. Mark pulled me into his arms, his embrace warm and grounding. "I'm proud of you," he said softly. "Me too," Sophie added, her eyes bright with emotion. "You did what you needed to do, and that's all that matters." For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a sense of peace. Cutting ties with my mother hadn't been easy, but it was necessary. It was a step toward reclaiming my life, toward building a future free from the pain of the past. And as I looked at the people who stood by me through it all, I realized I wasn't alone. Mark and Sophie were my family now, and with their support, I knew I could face whatever came next. The days that followed were a quiet revelation. I had spent so much of my life searching for validation, for approval, from Daniel, from my mother, even from myself. But now, for the first time, I felt free. The weight of unresolved anger, pain, and regret had lifted, and in its place was something I hadn't dared to feel for a long time: peace. Mark and I had fallen into an easy rhythm. Our relationship wasn't flashy or dramatic. It didn't need to be. It was built on quiet moments of understanding, shared laughter, and a deep sense of respect. He made me feel safe, not just from the outside world, but from the doubts that had lived in my own mind for so long. One evening, as we sat on the balcony of his apartment, watching the city lights flicker in the distance, I turned to him and smiled. "You know, I never thought I'd get here," I said softly. "Here?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "To a place where I could be happy again," I said. "With someone who makes me feel like I'm enough, just as I am." He took my hand in his thumb brushing gently over my knuckles. "You've always been enough," he said. "You just needed to see it for yourself." It was such a simple thing to say, but it struck me deeply. For years, I had tied my worth to what others thought of me, to how much I could give or how perfect I could be. But Mark had shown me that love wasn't about perfection. It was about acceptance, about seeing someone's flaws and loving them anyway. Sophie, of course, was thrilled about how things had turned out. She teased us mercilessly, often referring to herself as the mastermind behind your love story. But I knew she was just happy to see me smile again. "You deserve this," she said one afternoon as we sat in her living room, sipping coffee. "And honestly, so does Mark. You're good for each other." I couldn't argue with her. For the first time in years, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. A few weeks later, Mark and I went on a day trip to the countryside. He had found a quiet little spot with rolling hills and a view that seemed to stretch on forever. We spread out a blanket under the shade of an old oak tree, and as the afternoon sun warmed our skin, I found myself thinking about everything that had brought me here. Do you ever think about what you would say to your past self if you had the chance? I asked, breaking the comfortable silence. Mark tilted his head, considering the question. I think I'd tell him to be patient, he said, that everything he's waiting for is worth it. I smiled at that, then looked out at the horizon. I think I'd tell her to stop trying so hard to be perfect, I said, to stop chasing people who don't see her worth, and to trust herself more. She's stronger than she thinks. Mark reached over, tucking a strand of hair behind my ear. I think she'd be proud of you, he said. I blinked back the tears that threatened to fall, my chest swelling with gratitude. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the world in shades of gold and pink, I realized how far I had come. The woman I was now felt like a stranger to the version of me who had sobbed on Sophie's floor all those months ago, broken and betrayed. That woman had thought her world had ended. But in truth, it had only just begun. After everything, I learned that happiness wasn't about avoiding pain. It was about finding the strength to rise above it. It was about choosing love, not just for someone else, but for yourself. Mark and I didn't have everything figured out, but that was okay. What mattered was that we were figuring it out together. In the end, the journey hadn't been perfect. It had been messy and painful, full of moments where I doubted myself and questioned my worth. But through it all, I had found something I hadn't realized I was searching for: myself. As I leaned into Mark's embrace, the weight of the past finally felt like a distant memory. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew this much. I was ready for it. And for the first time in a long time, I was happy. Truly, completely happy. Afterward, looking back now, I can see how every moment, the heartbreak, the doubt, the fear, had led me here, to this place of peace and possibility. It wasn't easy, and there were times when I thought I wouldn't make it through. But I did. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this: life is unpredictable, and it will break you if you let it. But it will also surprise you in the most beautiful ways, if you're brave enough to keep going. So to anyone who feels like they're stuck in the dark, like they'll never find the light again, keep going. You're stronger than you think, and the best parts of your story might still be ahead of you. As for me, I'm finally writing a new chapter. And for the first time, I'm not afraid of what comes next.